Hey everyone, welcome back. And today we're talking about a very common topic here, which is that of motivation. And how do you keep yourself motivated? We're running a slightly different format, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave your comments down below in terms of whether this format works well for you. We've got two interviewers this time. We've got Stephanie here, who is a student. She's been on the course for a while. She's a little bit more familiar with some of the techniques and things. And then we've got Marvin here from Germany, who is sort of a student, but also a professional, and is looking at things from a slightly different angle, less kind of technically deep into it, but also looking at it from like a slightly older angle as well. So hopefully the two of them will be your voice and ask, all the right questions. So let's take it away. Let's get into it.
All right. Yeah, motivation is a topic that everyone talks about. I think every other day I hear people say, help, can you help me find motivation? I need to get motivated to study. So what do most students get wrong about motivation?
The thing that most students will get wrong about motivation is that, number one, I think students tend to often see motivation as something that is very inherent. It's kind of like a fixed attribute or a characteristic they have. Like, I'm a motivated person or I'm not a motivated person. They see motivation as this thing that is this driving influence, like a driving force that has to power every single behavior. They have to wake up feeling motivated. They have to have motivation to study. They have to have motivation to get their homework done or cover all the content. But the important thing there is that that's not actually how motivation works. Motivation is not, it's not the fire of like the steam engine where the steam powers everything. Motivation is it's like a secret weapon. Motivation is like a thing that you hold, that you protect and reserve. So when you really need to push through something, you have this to give. The worst case scenario is that you're using motivation on simple day-to-day things, such as just studying, getting through your routine. Therefore, using up all that motivation and not having any left in reserve when you really need it. And the problem is that if you think about motivation in kind of like this fixed thing that you just have, you're always just looking to top it up. You're always looking to just add more motivation because you're constantly burning through it all the time. And so you constantly need to just be topping up the motivation and adding more fuel to this. And that's not sustainable. We can't live and do much when we're constantly trying to top up with motivation. And so what we really need to start thinking about is, well, where does the motivation actually come from? And how do we facilitate it? And how do we protect it? How do we create systems of working and productivity that are not dependent on motivation in the first place? So that's the main thing.
So I get that, but what do you do if you have topics that are pretty uninteresting?
So you mean like subjects that you're studying, right?
Yeah, exactly.
This is an important distinction. So we can kind of divide it into like a couple of different components. We can talk about like the inherent interest that we have in the so there's this broad term, way we understand motivation, right? In terms of there being this sort of external motivation versus internal motivation, right? And when we have external motivation, this is a type of thing that is like, we may have a motivational video that we watch. We may have, a teacher or someone that is motivating us. I don't know, we might have this poster or a particular slogan or a saying that we read. Someone is encouraging. These are things that are externally motivating, as opposed to internal motivation, where these are things that are derived inherently from within yourself. Some people will call this intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. It's the same thing. But when we're talking about something like intrinsic motivation or internal motivation, there are multiple ways that this can be derived. So one, it can be derived from your own sense of identity, like the type of person you see yourself as. So for example, if you see yourself as someone that is really studious, then you may be inherently motivated to study because it aligns with your sense of who you are as a person. It's just like how if you see yourself as being sporty or religious or culturally of a certain type of culture, you are inherently motivated to do things and behave in a way that aligns with that sense of identity. So the first thing is about the identity. And some people don't see learning as an identity that they have. They see it as something that they need to do, but they don't see themselves as a learner. And therefore, they're less inherently motivated towards that. And there's a whole bunch that we could talk about in terms of aligning yourself with your sense of identity. The other place that a motivation can come from is just the activity or the task in itself? So what this is talking about is the task is inherently motivating. So you are motivated to do it because the task is inherently motivating. Games are actually a really good example. Games are designed to give you these rewards and make you feel really good about playing them. And so when you play this game, you're inherently motivated to play the game. You don't wake up being like, oh man, like I gotta play my game again today. Like I'm so sick of this. Like, just one more hour. Let me just play one more hour of playing this game, and then I can go back to doing something I really enjoy, like studying. Most people don't say that. And the reason is because games are inherently intrinsically motivating. The trick here is when we're talking about this type of motivation, is to think about what aspect of this are we not finding enjoyable and motivating. So let's zoom in on this part here. And we can say, okay, so this task or activity, we can be talking about studying a specific topic, but there's two angles there. Number one is the inherent interest that you have in the topic in itself. So this would be like saying, I'm inherently interested in human biology. I'm inherently interested in quantum physics. And so we may, for whatever reason, just be really interested in that. Maybe we grew up with some fun stories around it, or maybe we read some nice books, or your parents, talked about this a lot, or whatever it is. You saw some cool cartoon as a kid and you got interested. For whatever reason, we may be inherently interested in a specific topic. And that's a lucky situation. But for most people, you're learning more stuff that you are not inherently interested in than stuff that you are inherently interested in, especially in the early stages, especially through high school and early university. There's a lot of stuff that you feel like, I don't really care about this, but I need to learn it anyway to get the grades. So there, it's not really easy to get inherent interest in the topic in itself. Instead, we can have interest in the process of learning in itself. So this is process-specific interest. So the process of learning could be something that is fundamentally engaging and enjoyable. So for example, you could be studying, and the fact that you are studying could be engaging and enjoyable in itself. And the thing is, and this is the thing that most people don't realize, is that learning is inherently actually a very enjoyable thing. Most people actually enjoy learning. Most people like to have that feeling that they're acquiring knowledge and getting good at something and developing mastery. The problem is that most people are then studying in a way that does not even facilitate those same cognitive processes. You have learning, which is inherently enjoyable and feels great, and you walk out feeling like energized and engaged. But most people are studying in a way that makes them feel sleepy and tedious and drowsy, and it's monotonous and boring and not interesting. And what that means is that those studying processes are not activating the cognitive processes around learning. And once we change the studying technique so that it actually matches the process of learning, which again, most human beings are kind of wired to naturally enjoy, then you would actually find, even if the topic itself is very boring, you'd still find that it's relatively interesting to study and learn, because you're just enjoying the process of learning in itself. And that's the thing. So most people are not interested and intrinsically motivated by studying. And it's like, why would you be? When's the last time you were intrinsically motivated to do something that was tedious, boring? Maybe you weren't even good at it and you weren't getting the results that you wanted, and you were actively sacrificing other things that you actually enjoyed. None of that is a combination for something that it would be weird if that was motivating, right? That's kind of the situation, is that we want to have something that is more enjoyable and engaging in itself by modifying the techniques to activate the right processes, which is obviously, many of the things that I talk about. So the problem with most people is that it's not motivation. Motivation is not the issue. Motivation is the symptom. The problem is the process that they're using. They're doing something that sucks. Their brain is telling them, yo, this sucks. And it's like, yes, because it actually does suck. So the solution to that is not to say, how do I make myself do something that sucks? It's, how do I make it not suck in the first place? Yeah, that's the secret sauce, which is not like revolutionary in itself, but I think most people don't think about it that way when it comes to something like studying.
Do you have something like a real life example of this? Of getting started, of starting the nuclear reactor, because it does need a lot of energy to just getting started in the whole thing?
Yeah, so the important thing, I think, is that when you're starting from a point where you've got like zero motivation to do anything, if this is like motivation on the y-axis, and you're starting from a point where your current method is running like down here, and you have it's not giving you lots of motivation to do this, then even if you're able to bring it up to like this level, which objectively is not really motivating still. It's a lot more motivating than what you were doing before. It's like twice as motivating as what you were doing before. So it's not very difficult to start making a few strides on this. If everything you're doing when you're studying is going absolutely terribly, and then you start changing just one little thing, and that one little thing is a little bit more engaging, that is already very motivating. So it's not hard to start the chain reaction. It takes a lot of time and energy to get to the top, but it doesn't take a lot of time and energy to actually get there, because each step requires very little actual energy. All you need to do is just make one small change that is in the right direction. It doesn't even need to be the perfect step. As long as it's in the right general direction, it's going to be, fine. And at a certain point, when your technique, because I guess your technique is growing at the same time, when your technique gets sufficiently advanced enough, it gets harder and harder to make these improvements, because there are more, intricacies with the technique. But most people are nowhere near that. Most people are just using very passive strategies that are very time consuming and very repetitive. The most advanced strategy most people know is just smashing through Anki and flashcards over and over again. And so from that baseline, there's so many areas that we can improve on that it's almost, it's a free game. You just pick one thing that you can start applying. You don't even have to, like I teach a lot of techniques in my videos. You don't even need to apply all of the techniques that I teach. You can just pick one aspect of one part of a single video and just start by that. And that in itself will get you just one step closer. And when you've mastered, move to the next step and the next step and the next step and so on and so forth. And that's the way that you're meant to build through the progress. One of the things that I really hate about the way that a lot of people teach study skills is that, number one, it's very superficial. It's very sort of tips based. So as a result, it's not actually making things more motivating. It's a little bit motivating at the beginning because there's this short-term gain that you're getting from this tip, but it doesn't fundamentally change anything. You're still using the same ineffective approach to learning. It's still fairly repetitive. We just found more interesting ways of doing the repetition. But when you keep doing it, it's still repetitive and it's still the same cognitive processes that are being used. So it's eventually just going to be just as demotivating and just as exhausting as the old method. The only reason the new one is better is because it's at least novel and new and it feels more exciting for the next couple months. But at that point, you run into the same issue. And the reason this is bad is because it actually makes the problem worse. Because now you've tried so many things and you're still feeling like you're running into the cycle of demotivation. Like you try something new and then you're demotivated again. And you try something new and you're motivated and you do it and then you're demotivated. And you try something new and you're motivated and you demotivated again. It just cycles up and down like fluctuating motivation. And then you start thinking like, maybe there's something wrong with me. Why can't I just stay motivated? And the thing is, nothing about that behavior is inducive to actually being sustainably motivated. The trick to being sustainably motivated is to eliminate the root cause for the demotivation in the first place. And that takes a little bit of introspection. And we need to actually think about where we're deriving the motivation from. I didn't mention this explicitly, but we should be trying to derive more motivation from internal or intrinsic sources than from these external or extrinsic sources. Least of all, because you can't really control this often, whereas you can control the intrinsic stuff. You don't want to be dependent on having like a luck, you don't want to be lucky and get a good teacher that helps you be motivated. You want to be able to stay motivated by yourself intrinsically.
So you mentioned that people often fall into the trap of being tip-based, and you suggested that we should be working on one technique at one time, right? How do you think students should assess themselves to know if they're going for something tip-based that's just going to be demotivating over and over again, or it's something that's actually giving them progress?
Right. So you're talking about how you can even know whether this is a tip or whether it's something more significant than a tip?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a good question. I guess it's hard to know unless you really know what, like you already know about how sort of learning kind of works, which is number one, I think why it's important that people should actually have a theoretical understanding about, I know heaps of people complain on my videos about how my videos are too long and no one cares about the theory, but it's like, you should care about the theory, because if you know the theory, you can start problem solving this stuff for yourself. Like you don't want to have to watch all of my videos every single time you need an improvement. Like at a certain point, you should get to a level of knowledge and theoretical understanding that you understand how the brain works enough to fact check and see whether something makes sense or not. You should be able to look at a technique and think, I don't feel like that would really work because it goes against what I understand about how learning actually works. There's a process. So number one, having a bit of theoretical knowledge actually goes a long way. Number two, as a rule of thumb, generally speaking, if it seems really, really easy to do, like you could pick it up in like a few minutes, it's probably not going to make a big difference. There's a very small list of things that you can do very easily that make a huge difference. There are some things that you can do that make a big difference, where even if you do it wrong, it still provides a big improvement, right? Things like just trying to write a little bit less notes, things like trying to experiment with, drawing some relationships in your notes, things like thinking a little bit more before writing down notes, or having a distraction sheet where you write down the distractions that you faced during a focus session and try to remove them in the next session, doing some basic pre-study for like 15, 20 minutes before you cover a topic. Like even if you do that wrong, you're still going to get a bit of benefit from it. Having said that, all of those things have more advanced versions that are like even more efficient. But if there's anything that feels like this is pretty easy and it seems like it's going to provide this improvement without me needing to put in much effort, it's probably not going to really do much difference, because if it was that easy, everyone would do it, and then it wouldn't be much of a secret. Usually these tips are things that kind of work, but they don't really work consistently. There's a lot of conditions for it working. For a lot of people that use it, it doesn't really work that well. So it's one of those things that's kind of like, yeah, sure, give it a go. Don't expect it to be the thing that completely flips your world upside down and changes the way that you think about learning altogether, which is probably the thing that would make the biggest difference and solve most of your problems. But it is something that's like, yeah, sure, you could give it a go, or you could not give it a go. It probably doesn't really matter. What matters is the actual, like the retraining process. Stuff that usually takes a little bit of investment and a little bit of work. It's like making money. Everyone knows that like get rich quick schemes probably are not going to work, but there probably are some that actually work, right? Like there's probably some that will help you make some money in the short term, but there's not going to be any real ways of making a lot of money in a very short period of time that doesn't involve some pretty significant investment and some pretty significant transformation that most people are not going to do. Otherwise, everyone will be rich. So just the very fact that that's not the case is enough. So that's kind of a filter that I would use.
So, Justin, what is your ultimate advice on motivation?
If I had to isolate it down to just one thing, I'd probably say that my ultimate advice is to make sure that you're very clear about what specifically is stopping you from being motivated, and isolate it down. Don't broadly just say like, I am demotivated, like as an entity, like as an existence in this universe, I just like float around demotivated. Don't say that. Think, what about like, where am I motivated? Where am I not motivated? And why? And keep going down that hole until you've isolated the problem. For most people, when it comes to studying, the part that demotivates them is the process of studying itself. And it's not the process of learning, because they are motivated by learning other things. And if we can isolate that, that tells us the problem is in this example, the studying process, and we can actually change that, and we can start bridging those things together. And at the very least, what it gives is a sense of hope. You don't have to live a demotivated, empty life. That doesn't have to be the norm. I know it is kind of the norm for a lot of people, but it doesn't have to be. One of the most common pieces of feedback that we get from people that have worked through the course, and both of you will actually know this and have felt this for yourselves, right? Is that when you start actually using more engaging learning techniques, it actually legitimately starts feeling more interesting, right? Like you're actually more engaged in the learning process, and it actually becomes legitimately more enjoyable. And the act of studying actually becomes more motivating because of the fact that it's more enjoyable. And that's purely a side effect. Like when you guys were learning some of the techniques, were you actively trying to like increase your level of motivation by learning these techniques?
No, that came as like a side effect.
Yeah, it's more like a side effect, yeah.
Even if you're just focusing on just increasing the study technique, the benefit that it has on motivation is usually very linear and it's often very predictable. Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a long tip, but that's probably the final thing that I'd leave with.